This is a very broad one, and it's also one that I think fits both a more secular paradigm as well as a Christian paradigm. And we're going to see its relevance right away in the Old Testament tonight, and that will follow through to the New Testament later. But Kirk and I are going to define politics very broadly as the art of living well together in the city. The word politics comes from the Greek word polis, which is the word for city. If any of you remember Aristotle, Aristotle talks about this a lot. Politics is about how we organize our lives well as we begin living together in a city. As human beings get more complex in society, from individuals to families, to tribes, to villages, to towns, to cities, to nations, the need to organize, to steward, to be intentional about how we live our lives together grows. And in whatever else politics is, that's what politics is. It's about learning to live well together. There's three things I want to point out real quickly that I like about this definition. The first is that it reminds us that while politics does include what today we would call the state, voting, politicians who are elected, things like that, it certainly includes a lot more than that. One of probably the big mistakes we tend to make today is to think that politics is exhausted by who the president is, or who our senators and congressmen and women are, who's a judge on the Supreme Court, or who's in power at the White House. And politics does include that, but it really is something that's local, that connects to schools, that connects to cities, that connects to art, that connects to sports, that connects to money. It connects to so much of our life together, and therefore it's much more relevant than just who we're going to vote for in November. It does include that, but we would love for us all to walk away after this weekend having a sense, not only that, our political responsibility as human beings, as citizens, as Christians, includes voting. It includes kind of being aware of the issues, but we hope that there's a sense that it includes much more than that, and the importance of it and why that matters. A second reason we like about this definition is that it reminds us, and it helps us to avoid a mistake that not only often happened during the Enlightenment, in the Western world, a very politically formative time, but a mistake that I think even many of us as Christians can fall into, especially if, to be honest, if your inclination, your personality like mine is maybe to be a little more cynical about politics than it is to be optimistic about it, which is that it reminds us, this definition, that politics is the art of living well together in the city, that politics is an essentially good pursuit. It's an essentially creational reality. It is not a necessary evil that only exists because of sin. It does take on new forms because of evil and injustice and human sinfulness, but politics is not, to use biblical kind of terminology, a post-fall or post-Genesis 3 reality. Politics was going to be part of the story from the beginning, even apart from sin. Cities were going to be where the story went. We weren't going to stay in a garden forever. And so politics is an essentially good pursuit. It is not, maybe the most obvious political thinker who kind of fits this bill is it's not, like Thomas Hobbes thought, a way of just managing and imposing a nicer grid on a world that is essentially chaotic and violent and brutal. Politics is a fundamentally good vocation that grows up out of creation's goodness and wisdom and out of God's call. Again, sin does impact it, injustice and evil does impact it, but it doesn't create the need or the reality of politics. And then third and finally, it reminds us that the art of living well together in the city, that it includes ideology, it includes knowing the right truth, it includes worldview, but it's also a wisdom category. It requires experience, it requires character, it requires love for God and love for neighbor. It requires an awareness of our context. There's not just a one-size-fits-all set of predetermined answers you memorize and then you're just going to be good at politics. That politics is an art that requires wisdom and that requires context. And so 45 minutes to do an overview of the Old Testament with respect to politics. This is a bit absurd, but a couple of kind of introductory remarks. If you want to open up your Bible, you can, but because this is so big picture, it really is going to be a very selective overview of the Old Testament, but I hope an informative one, and I hope an accurate one. Again, along the way, feel free to keep that Google Doc open and to write down your questions, disagreements, observations, things that you want to see Pastor Kirk and I get into a little more. Let me start off our exploration of the Old Testament with two quotes. The first is from Oliver O'Donovan, and one of the things Kirk and I will do a few times this weekend is give you some recommendations of resources you might pursue in the future. And one of the most important political texts by a Christian thinker and theologian in the last 50 years is by Oliver O'Donovan, who's taught at Oxford for a number of years and is maybe the most important Christian ethicist and political theorist in the last 50 years or so. In his book, The Desire of the Nations is probably his most important book on politics and the Christian faith. He says this about the Old Testament: Israel's knowledge of God's blessing was from beginning to end a political knowledge. And it was out of that knowledge that the evangelists and the apostles of the New Testament spoke about Jesus. And what O'Donovan is pointing out is it's not that first there's religion or first there's a more general human condition and then politics gets added on to that or it's just peripheral, but Israel's experience of God and of what it means to be human and of who they are as the people of God was inherently political from the beginning. For instance, we can't really understand what concepts and terminology, both in the Old and the New Testament, like kingdom, covenant, law, God is king or Lord, even, and we're going to start here in a moment, the image of God that human beings are created in is a political concept in the ancient world. Servants, hesed, covenant, loyal love to God or to the king that you are under. Peace, shalom, righteousness and justice, obedience, salvation and deliverance. All of these concepts, all of these terms are terms that first existed in the political world of the ancient Near East and that were taken up, just like, say, the sacrificial system was, or temples, or ways of thinking about what it means to be human in God, to use John Calvin's great analogy. Doesn't create a new language out of nothing when he reveals himself, but he speaks baby talk to us. He condescends and he takes the language and the concepts and the culture that's already there and he redirects it or he baptizes it. And so much of Israel's language for God, for being human, for being the people of God is political. Christopher Wright, and this is probably the other resource that I would mention tonight, the best thing that I have seen as an overview of what the Old Testament says with respect to politics is a chapter in this book, Old Testament Ethics for the People of God by Christopher Wright. He is a great theologian. He was kind of John Stott's right-hand man, if you know who John Stott was in England. And in this book, which is very influential on how I'm going to do an overview of the Old Testament tonight, here's what Wright says. For Israel, politics was not something extraneous to their theological or spiritual faith. Rather, the entire vocabulary in which Israel spoke of its relationship to God was derived from the realm of politics. And again, it's very similar to what Oliver O'Donovan says. So as we begin to get into the Old Testament, and I cast a very big picture framework, I'm going to have to be very selective. So let me just give you a sense of what we're going after, what I'm looking for. The first is I'm looking to kind of capture as quickly but hopefully as faithfully as I can, kind of the plot line of the Old Testament. If you've ever, as many Christians often do around January 1st, kind of committed to trying to read the Bible in a year, when you read through the Old Testament for a number of reasons, its foreignness to us and its historical distance to us today, its unfamiliarity to most of us with our biblical literacy in our culture, just its vastness. It's a really big book. It's way bigger than the New Testament. It is really easy to feel like you get lost in the forest in the Old Testament and to not really know why this is happening or why that's being said or how it all connects. What I want to do is give an overall sense of what the plot line is. Second, then I want to locate politics, government, the state within that. I also want to talk about not just what the plot line of the Old Testament is, how Israel's story is told, but I want to really focus on how the story is told. Just to give one obvious analogy or illustration, when you read the New York Times or watch Fox News, you're very aware, not just that you're being told allegedly what's happening, but you're getting a very specific way of how the story is being told. There's a sense, even though most of the time we're not aware of it and other people aren't being straightforward about it, explicit about it, that some things are being highlighted and other things are being backgrounded. Some things are being focused on and other things are being left behind. Just to give probably my favorite example of this reality, it is very significant to think about the Old Testament as a philosophy of history, of what history is about, of what God's mission in the world is, of what his purposes are and how he's trying to accomplish it. It is very significant, though I think we often don't meditate on it enough, that in Exodus 1 and 2, we never learn Pharaoh's name. But we learn the names of two Hebrew midwives, and we learn the name of Moses, and we learn about what's happening in an obscure, marginalized group. And when you read Daniel, it's really interesting that you know Daniel's name and his Hebrew name and his three friends' names, but you never learn about the court-appointed leaders at the top apart from Nebuchadnezzar. And even Nebuchadnezzar is a secondary category compared to Daniel and his three friends. It's not just what the Old Testament says, it's how the story is told, the emphases of it, where the focus is and where the focus is not, that I think more than anywhere else is where we should grow in wisdom. You can say the right thing in the wrong way and actually lose the truth. And I think often today, it's not just what we say or what we think about politics that can be wrong, but it's putting the tone, the accent, the emphasis in the wrong places and not putting it in the places where it should be. That is often our mistake as Americans, as Christians. So here's the first thing I want to observe. For some of you, this might be very common knowledge. For others of you, it might be a bit of an aha moment, which is the Old Testament there's lots of ways you can break it down, but here's one observation, which is the entire story is told pretty quickly in the Old Testament, from Genesis to 2 Kings, which is only about a third of the Old Testament. The entire storyline is already there. And so we're going to focus on that storyline tonight. Everything from First Chronicles to Malachi, and that's the order of our English Bibles today, at least in most Protestant and Catholic traditions, is really interpretive commentary on the significance and the ongoing relevance of what happened from Genesis to 2 Kings. But when you finish 2 Kings, that's the end of Israel's story. They're in exile, but they're about to come back. Or at least there's the prospect of that. And so you could kind of say the Old Testament storyline goes from Eden to exile. And that entire story is already told by the time you get to the end of 2 Kings. It's not at all kind of a major part of my presentation tonight, but in most, to this day, Jewish orderings of the Old Testament, or what they might call the Hebrew Bible, as well as many older Christian traditions, First and Second Chronicles is not meant to follow First and Second Kings. If you've ever read First and Second Kings and then immediately gone to First and Second Chronicles, it's going to be very boring and very strange, because First and Second Chronicles retells all the same stories of First and Second Kings. And if you really pay attention closely, you can pick up on, but they tell the stories slightly differently at times. First and Second Kings is much older, and it's basically written at the same time that Deuteronomy and Exodus are written, but First and Second Chronicles are post-exilic. They're some of the latest books in the Old Testament, and they retell just First and Second Chronicles, the entire story, but from a later vantage point. And so, for instance, even though maybe our eyes glaze over and we get very bored, the first, I believe it's 6 or 8 chapters of First Chronicles is just one long genealogy. And the first name in First Chronicles 1 is not Abraham or Moses or David or Solomon, it's Adam. It starts in Eden and it catches you up to the exile, and it retells the story, not in case you forgot it, but in order to give a new sense of what its significance was for a people living in exile later on. Arguably, the New Testament has a very similar kind of twofold structure. Matthew through Acts, the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts tell the story, and then the rest, Romans through Revelation, is interpretive commentary on the significance and ongoing relevance of what happened in Matthew through Acts. And so as we think about the Old Testament storyline, we have the story itself, and then we already have inspired commentary about what the story means, what its significance is, and so on. In the next few minutes, and it's going to be brief, but here are kind of the three areas I'm going to focus on. The first is the role of politics in creation and fall, which is Genesis 1 through 11. And even though that's a very small section of the Old Testament, proportionally speaking, it bears a weight of importance all out of size to its length. The second stage, or the second focus tonight, will be on politics in Israel's story, and this will be the heart of what we do, and I hope there'll be some aha moments that are helpful for us here. And then finally, I'm going to end by just drawing out some lessons that Israel learned about politics along the way, from Eden to exile. So real quickly, Genesis 1 through 11, you don't need to turn there, but everything in Genesis 1 through 11 is cosmic and international in scope. Israel's story technically starts in Genesis 12 when God calls Abram out of the nations that he belongs to and that he lives in Ur. We'll talk about that in a moment. And Genesis 1 through 2 is the creation story, which is so important for everything that comes later. Genesis 3 is the fall. And in Genesis 4 through 11 includes some famous stories like Noah's flood, Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel. But I think sometimes we maybe even there already begin to lose the plot. What exactly is going on there? And one of the things you might notice if you reread Genesis 1 through 11 in the near future is from Genesis 4, the first East of Eden post-fall story, all the way to Genesis 11 is arguably what holds those chapters together is city. Cities are constantly popping up in Genesis 4 through 11. Cain settles in a city. The Tower of Babel is itself an attempt to build a city that will lead to something new. And so again, politics is the art of living well together in the city, and cities play a fundamental role in Genesis 4 through 11. Again, it's often pointed out that the biblical storyline starts in a garden, but it ends in a city. And sometimes that could be understood, I think, wrongly as a concession that God makes to human sinfulness, but I think it's actually where the story was supposed to go. But because of human sinfulness and rebellion against God, cities become at the same time places of potential and humanity and thriving, but also places of injustice and idolatry and evil and death. And so cities become deeply ambiguous realities almost from the beginning. In terms of Genesis 1 and 2, the creation story, there's so much we could talk about. I'll just mention a few things. One, and I kind of just alluded to this a moment ago, the Imago Dei, the image of God that human beings are created in, is a concept that already existed in the ancient Near East, and it's a political concept. Namely, kings in their capital city, in the middle of their realm, had authority over the entire realm, but they could only be in one place, in the throne room, in the capital city. And when it came time to figure out, well, how did the people who live over there, and it's my land, how do they know who's in charge, is kings would create statues of themselves and place it throughout the land where they were not themselves physically present, to be a reminder that this is who is in charge of this land politically. It's not only that we know that indirectly through the ancient Near East and its culture and its politics, but explicitly God creates humanity in the image of God and gives them a commission to rule the world and to subdue it. And so from the beginning, we see that authority, kingdom, rule are connected to God's pre-fall, the world getting broken by sin purposes, and that for whatever reason, and I don't have time to speculate about it tonight, that God chooses from the beginning not to rule the world directly, but to delegate authority to human beings who will have political rule over the world under God, but over the world. And so when you think about the original design of creation, it's God above us, the world below us, human beings as the mediators of God's own authority. We are beholden to our Creator, but also given authority over the world. The second thing that I want to mention, and this itself I think is so worth exploring more, perhaps another time, which is sometimes in the Western Christian tradition, I fear that we have this sense that the storyline is, to use a famous kind of sequence that at least goes back to Augustine, that the sequence is kind of creation, fall, redemption, consummation, which I think is true. It's a good way to kind of think about the storyline, but that the way you think about it is before the fall, in creation, we were without sin, we were righteous. Because of the fall, we become sinners. In redemption, to use Martin Luther's great phrase, we are simultaneously righteous and sinful. And in the future, when Jesus comes back and the world is made new, we will once again be righteous. And I think all of that is true insofar as it goes, but what's misleading about it is it makes you think, if that's your paradigm, that the last stage is merely a return to the first stage. And that's not actually the logic of the biblical storyline. The logic of the biblical storyline is not only were we called to rule over the world, but we are also called to subdue it. And to subdue something means that you're breaking into shape something that's not yet what it's supposed to be. Again, the point was, to use an illustration I often use with students, that we misunderstand the creation story if we think that God was essentially creating the world perfectly finished the way it's supposed to be forever, and kind of like parents, after they've spent a whole afternoon cleaning the house, look at their children and say with exasperation, whatever you do, please don't mess it up. And that's like the only thing you hope that your children won't do. They won't mess up the house you've cleaned. Sometimes I think we can limit the human vocation to that. The world was already perfect. It was already exactly what God wanted it to be. And we were given one command, just don't mess it up. But that's actually not the logic of the storyline. We were supposed to move from a garden into a city. We were supposed to bear fruit and multiply. We were supposed to develop culture. We were supposed to create sports and art and unfold the potential that's there in creation. God created the world good, but not perfect. He began the work and he rested when he was done, but then he delegated the remaining tasks to human beings, which again, in its truest sense, is a political task: to unfold the potential of creation, to organize it well for everyone's flourishing, to represent God's character, how we do that. And again, politics is not just, well, the world is inherently awful and brutal and violent, and in politics is about, kind of like Lord of the Flies, kind of imposing an order that's not already there. The world is, according to the Christian worldview, the Christian story, essentially good, essentially social. We are created to be social creatures. We're created for friendship and shalom and justice. It's not politics that saves us from the opposite of that, or that creates the opposite of that. Politics is there to steward that as it becomes more complex, and to protect it from tainting as it's tainted by sin. So a lot more we could talk about, but I'll just jump to the end of Genesis 1 through 11, and then we're going to look at the rest of our time at Israel's story. Genesis 10 and 11, one chapter is pretty obscure, and our eyes glaze over with boredom. The other chapter is pretty famous. Chapter 11 of Genesis is the Tower of Babel. It's a really famous story, and it's self-significant, as we're going to see in a second, that it is a predecessor to Babylon. Babel, one of the great cities later on that's filled with idolatry and injustice, and that often oppresses the people of God. But Genesis 10 is often known as the Table of Nations. It's a list of about 70 nations, all Gentile pagan nations, that show up later on in the storyline and that come from Noah's 3 sons. And what's interesting, among other things, is one, Genesis 10 and Genesis 11 are out of order. Genesis 11 logically comes before Genesis 10, because the Tower of Babel in the biblical storyline is, among other things, the origin of why all these diverse peoples with their languages even exist. And so Genesis 10 is actually kind of forecasting what will come from the Tower of Babel much later on. But two, the Tower of Babel is the background to God's call for Abraham. There's so many connections between Genesis 11, all the nations that have gone astray from their creator, and the call of Abram, namely, above all else, that in Abraham, all the nations will one day be blessed that are right now under God's curse and judgment. There's lots of other connections between Genesis 11, the end of the universal international history, cosmic history, and Genesis 12, the call of Abraham. But Abraham's call, the existence of the people of God, has its rationale as an emergency, interventionary response to the disaster of all the nations going astray from the one true God. Abraham is to be the solution, as N.T. Wright often says, to what went wrong in Genesis 1 through 11. He is to be the source of blessing among peoples that are now under curse. And that itself is indicative of the way the rest of the Old Testament storyline is told. What I think separates the Old Testament from both Fox News and the New York Times more than anything else is its obsession with the people of God and its putting on the periphery who is in the halls of power of the pagan nations. Fox News and the New York Times, they disagree on a million things. What they agree on is that what's going on in the White House in Washington, D.C. is more important than what's happening in local churches around the country and around the world. And the Old Testament itself, as Walter Brueggemann, a great Old Testament scholar, says, is obsessed with keeping the spotlight on Israel. No matter what empires are rising or falling later on, no matter what political configuration and circumstances Israel is in, whether the people of God are being faithful or unfaithful is the key to whether the rest of the world is going to be restored or is going to continue to languish in darkness. There's much more to the story than that, but that's crucial. Moving on briefly in the next few minutes to basically Genesis 12 to Malachi, which is a lot of stuff in there. I'm relying on Christopher Wright's wonderful treatment here. There's different ways you can break this down, but from Genesis 12 to the end of Malachi, or to go back to the earlier framework, from Genesis 12 to the end of 2 Kings, Israel goes through arguably 4 stages of political configuration. Some of these are chosen by God. Think of Mount Sinai. Some of them are chosen by Israel themselves, asking for a king, Saul, David, when God himself seems to not be a big fan of this idea. Some of them are imposed on Israel from the outside, like being a wandering pilgrim people in exile in Babylon. But throughout the story, there are 4 stages, and you could break this down in different ways, but I think this is the clearest way to break it down. The first stage goes from Genesis 12, when God calls Abraham, to the end of Genesis. So it's Genesis 12 to Genesis 50. And at this stage of the story, God's people are sojourners, exiles, pilgrims. To use the language of Genesis 23, verse 4, Abraham confesses, he's still Abram at this point, he confesses, we are foreigners and exiles in a land that is not ours. And so the people of God begin their story as politically homeless outsiders. And we're going to see it is very significant that that's where Israel's story ends as well in the Old Testament. The first stage and the fourth stage, they're not identical because of what's happened in between, but they are very parallel, namely exile, diaspora, being scattered among other people who rule over you, who have the rule, and yet knowing that you belong to God and that this is not God's ideal for the world, but being called to be faithful in exile. Pastor Kirk later tonight will talk, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow morning as well, that the New Testament also adopts this framework. 1 Peter, Hebrews, the letter of James starts with to the 12 tribes scattered in the diaspora, and he's not actually talking to the 12 literal tribes. This is the paradigm for Christian existence, where the Old Testament begins and ends the story of Israel. Real quick, before I get to the 2 middle stages, because they are important, even though they're no longer normative, there are all kinds of parallels between the first stage, Genesis 12 through 50, Abraham and the patriarchs, outsiders, marginalized, exiles, sojourners, pilgrims in a land under rule that's not their own and rule that doesn't acknowledge the God of Israel. And the last stage, exile in Babylon and all the complexities that flow from that. Namely, not only is the language of sojourner, exile, pilgrim, foreigner dominate both stages. But I didn't know this until recently as I began getting ready for this. If you remember, Abram is called out at the very end of Genesis 11 and then in Genesis 12, and he himself becomes the father of Israel, the father of the people of God, and the prototype for all faithful believers later on. Think of Romans 4 for the Apostle Paul. Abram is called out of Ur. Not only was Babel the backdrop in Genesis 11, but Ur is where Babylon is later on. And so the story of Israel begins and ends in the Old Testament with God's chosen people in exile as sojourners, politically homeless in a place that's identified with Babylon. Another parallel is that two of the only stories in the Old Testament that really flesh out in an extended narrative way what it looks like for the people of God to be faithful in these kinds of circumstances are Joseph at the end of Genesis as he ascends in influence in the Egyptian government, and Daniel at the end of the Old Testament as he ascends in influence in the Babylonian structures of power and empire. And I think that we're not going to have time tonight to look at it in depth. I think that if we understand the Old Testament storyline well, and many Christians intuitively know this, but I want to flesh it out with a bit more specificity. Joseph and Daniel are two of the most important stories for understanding what political faithfulness looks like in the context we find ourselves in. David can teach us things. Moses can teach us things, but we are not in a theocracy anymore. We are not in a monarchy anymore. Neither was Israel, the generations that the Hebrew Bible was written for, nor are Christians. And so what we can learn from Moses and Mount Sinai and the theocracy there, what we can learn from David and Zion and the monarchy is always indirect. But what we can learn from Joseph and Daniel is direct. Because even if the details change, that is our paradigm. We are also in a place that is not our home. Other people are ruling who do not acknowledge the God of Israel, the God who raised Jesus from the dead, and we are called neither to withdraw and to not care and to separate, but neither is there an option of actually transforming it so that we are in charge and it actually becomes a theocracy or a monarchy. That those are the two poles that aren't options, and we need to stay in between. And so in the future, as you read the stories of Joseph and Daniel, really good questions to ask are, what are they trying to do? And also, what are they not trying to do? What do they feel like the limits are? And for instance, in both stories, there is a strong emphasis on they're trying to influence, they're trying to bless, they're trying to serve the people in general, but they're also keeping an eye out for the people of God in particular and making sure that their identity and their vocation is protected, and in their own behavior. Where the tension most often comes from is when the ways of Egypt or the ways of Babylon and the ways of being faithful to Israel's God run into each other. So Joseph is not going to sleep with Potiphar or Potiphar's wife. Daniel is not going to eat unclean, non-kosher food. He's not going to bow down to the golden statue. And both of these stories remind us that that's where the tension tends to be politically for the people of God. How can we be faithful in these circumstances and yet, to use great language from the Gospel of John, not be of these circumstances, not be shaped by these circumstances? How can we be loyal to the God who's created and redeemed us and yet still be useful and active in these circumstances? There are limits within the call. Those two stories, I think, should come to the surface as we see the plot line of the Old Testament more accurately. Okay, without getting into all the details, the second stage is basically Exodus to the end of Judges. And this is itself theocracy. That is, it's a form where God doesn't rule directly over his people or the world, but he does rule directly through religious leaders. Moses is a religious leader not really a political leader, or at least he's only a political leader as a religious leader. The judges are religious leaders first and foremost. This is theocracy in various forms, where God rules directly through the religious leaders of the society over Israel. Starting in 1 Samuel and going until the end of 2 Kings, until the final exilic moment when Babylon, led by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC, defeats the southern kingdom of Judah, destroys Jerusalem, and burns the temple to the ground, and carries the southern kingdom off into exile. Until that moment, technically, Israel is a monarchy all those centuries. That itself often goes really badly. If you have ever read 1st and 2nd Kings or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it is far more often than not a depressing story. There are far more wicked kings than there are good ones. And even the good ones have warts. Sometimes the wicked ones are just wicked. There's nothing redemptive about them. And then even very quickly, Saul's a bad start. David rises up. Overall, he's a positive character, but he does a lot of bad stuff. And then Solomon rises up after David's death. And he again starts off well, but he plunges pretty quickly into idolatry, into intermarrying with lots of women from other nations. His heart goes astray. He begins to ignore the laws of God. And if you read those stories closely, it's not just that Solomon in his own private life went astray, but he becomes increasingly oppressive of his own people. Forced labor is a big theme in the stories of Solomon. In order to bring all the wealth that he accomplished, he forces his own people into labor, almost a return to Pharaoh in Exodus. And then after Solomon's death, the kingdom of Israel, the monarchy, splits into two in a civil war. Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and the northern and the southern kingdom are at odds with each other for the rest of Israel's story until exile. So the monarchy overall doesn't come across super well in the Old Testament. If you want to, for the second stage, Moses, third stage, David, theocracy, and monarchy, if you want to associate really important biblical words with each one, the second stage is Sinai, and the third stage is Zion. And these two stages, while they are no longer accessible to the people of God later on directly, they do remain forever important. And want to say this real quick before I move on to some lessons that Israel learned. Sinai, above all else, becomes something that the people of God regularly remember. And the Passover and the various feasts of the Old Testament. Think of how often the Psalms call us to remember what God did in the Exodus. And we're to remember this is who we are. This is where our story starts as the people of God. This is the law he gave us. And wherever we are, even though we're not at Sinai anymore, even though we're in exile, these are the laws and the commandments we are to keep no matter what the cost, no matter how inconvenient we are. Our first job is not to change Babylon, but to be faithful to the laws of Sinai. And Zion, even though it's lost, even though there's no Davidic king, even though Jerusalem and his temple are destroyed, Zion, if Sinai becomes a memory in the past, that both protects us from nostalgia. We can't go back to that, but that nonetheless reminds us of who we are and what we are to do. We are to be a people of obedience to God's commands. We are to reflect his character in whatever nations we are in. Zion becomes our hope for the future. A king is coming. God will one day rule directly over the world and over us, not these pagan nations. One of the things we'll get a chance to talk about a lot tomorrow, and I imagine this will be something that maybe there's some good debate over, is whatever else you think about the United States of America, whether you essentially think it's got a great, glorious history, whether you think its history is primarily oppression and injustice, whether you think it's somewhere in between, the United States of America is not a permanent state of affairs. There will be no, to use common language today, secular governments in the world to come. There will be politics in the world to come. There will be statescraft in the world to come. There will still be a need for leaders who organize and steward and rule over with God's delegated authority, but that will no longer be in the form of these pagan secular nations that base their identity and reality on something other than the revelation of God at Sinai, and especially Jesus. And so Zion becomes the great prototype of what we hope for in the future. Think of how the story ends at the end of Revelation. A new Jerusalem, Zion, comes down. The second coming of Jesus is the return of the king, the Davidic king. Zion becomes what we hope for as we live out our lives scattered in exile. And the reason I think that's important is, on the one hand, I really do want to emphasize that exile, diaspora is normative as a paradigm, both for the Old Testament and later for the New, but it's also really important that we don't romanticize exile, that we don't romanticize being sojourners, that we don't romanticize being on the margins or being outsiders who aren't in the halls of power, because this is not the permanent state of affairs. Maybe one way to crystallize a lot of what I'm saying is one question we should regularly ask ourselves as we read the biblical storyline and then wonder what's the relevance for us today, is to ask the question, what time is it? Or to maybe make it a little more narrative, what chapter are we in? And one of the big mistakes Christians have often made in history is trying to either speed up the story so we're in a further chapter than we actually are, or to forget that we're already past that chapter and you can't go back to theocracy. You can't go back to Davidic monarchy. That is an important part of the story and we learn from it, but that's not where we are anymore. If Israel knew anything, and I'm sure I'll talk about this more tomorrow in different sessions, if Israel knew anything, and I think in general, Jewish communities throughout history have known this well, is Jewish communities are by and large, whether here in the US or throughout history elsewhere, scattered in diaspora, no longer in Palestine, no longer a nation of their own. They're almost always really involved in politics in whatever culture they're in. They also know very deeply that Washington, D.C. can never become Jerusalem, that the United States of America can never become Israel, that the Goyim can never become the covenant people of God. And one of the big, if I had to sum up 2 or 3 mistakes that I see Christians make most often, is to forget that the analogy or the parallel to the United States of America is not Israel, it's Egypt and Babylon and Assyria and Greece and Persia and Rome. And we'll see this in a second. Not all empires are the same. Some are critiqued more by the prophets. Some are looked at more favorably. But nonetheless, the church equals Israel in the new covenant. And all the nations the church finds itself within equals Babylon and Persia and Assyria, all the places we're scattered to. That doesn't mean that every nation is the same. It doesn't mean, and this is one of the reasons that I truly think, even though it's often caricatured and cliched and overly familiar, that Jeremiah 29 is one of the most practical political passages of the Old Testament. We're in Babylon. We're called to remain faithful to our own identity and story, but we are also to seek the welfare of the city. And so real quick, and then we'll end, and we'll do some Q&A. You can be writing down your questions in that Google Doc. And then after that, Kirk will look at the New Testament. Here are some lessons that Israel learned. And again, I have to be so selective here, but trying to get to the heart of it. Here's the first lesson: that no political configuration or set of circumstances, politically, socially in the world, either guarantees or prevents the faithfulness of God's people to their task, to their mission, to their vocation. That's not to say that all political configurations are equal. That's not to say that some don't include more injustice or less oppression and more reflecting God's image. But it is to say that none of them are the key thing. Israel learned that they could be faithful in any circumstances, but they also learned that they could be unfaithful even in the most ideal circumstances. And so the circumstances outside of the people of God are important, they're always relevant, but they're never central or determinative to what's going on. And the second lesson was this, very related, that Israel's obedience to God's laws, faithfulness to God's mission in the world is central to what God wants to do in all the nations. Think of, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, before he gives us any commands, tells us who we are. And he says, you are the light of the world, you are the salt of the earth, and you are a city set on a hill. And Jesus didn't make any of that up. That's Isaiah 2. That's Micah 4. That's what Israel was supposed to be among the nations. The place that all the nations look to and say, oh, that's what it means to be human. That's what true politics looks like. That's what it means to really flourish. And that the nations would come to us. To put it this way, the nations are transformed into what they are supposed to be through the faithfulness of God's people. God's people don't transform the nations into what they're supposed to be through politics. It is our own faithfulness to bearing God's image well that ultimately is the focus of the storyline. Here's a third thing, and I haven't talked about this much, but I think it's crucial, that on the one hand, God holds all the nations accountable for justice and injustice, for morality and immorality, but not in the same way he holds Israel accountable. And this is going to be a big theme of one of the sessions tomorrow, that on the one hand, to put two extremes before us, I think we all know that there are some things that only Christians are supposed to try to obey. And that the state has no business, a secular state has no business punishing people for not doing. So for instance, when we read stories of, say, Puritan New England and getting fined for playing sports on the Sabbath, or getting arrested for not going to church, or something like that, that's a misunderstanding of the relationship between the church and the state. There are some things as Christians we should only expect other Christians to be doing, and then we shouldn't be trying to impose on the world. To use one of Paul's great passages in 1 Corinthians 5, what do we have to do with judging outsiders? We judge ourselves. We make sure we police ourselves, but we don't hold the same standard over the world. On the other hand, you can't go to the other extreme and say, well, it's the world, it's not the people of God. So who are we to say you shouldn't murder and you shouldn't steal and you shouldn't rape? Like, there are things that all human beings, regardless of whether they belong to the people of God or not, are held accountable by God to do. And a great reminder of that is Amos 1 and 2. And just in general, the oracles against the nations in the Old Testament, in the prophets, where we are reminded that God is the judge of the nations. But then, and I'll end with this here in a second, that God also, even as he judges the nations, ultimately seeks to bless the nations through his people. The nations are not going to bless themselves. God isn't going to directly bless them apart from his people, but God's purposes for the nations goes through the blessing that he imparts to his people. And so, not all empires are the same, but whichever empires we find ourselves in exile, we are to seek the welfare of the city as much as we can, but never by transgressing our own call to be faithful to God's commands, even if it means suffering, even if it means a decline of our influence, even if it means being on the outside and the margins. I want to conclude with this real quick, and then we'll do some Q&A. I encourage you to look this up later. I just want to share one particular story of the Old Testament that is not well known in my experience, and in one sense goes in a slightly different direction, but I find really encouraging, really powerful, and especially in our political moment today, the chaos, the discouragement of where we are as a culture. Almost nobody's encouraged where we are right now politically, whatever their political views are. There's a story that is told in 2 Kings 21 that is then retold in 2 Chronicles 33. And it's about a king named Manasseh. I don't know if you remember Manasseh. Manasseh is Hezekiah's son. Hezekiah is where the king of the southern kingdom is where Isaiah finishes the first half of his book. He's the one who's on his deathbed and he prays to God for more years and he gets them. And he's basically the last king before exile. What Isaiah doesn't tell you, because he assumes you know, but 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles do, is that Manasseh was the final nail in the coffin. He was an incredibly wicked king. And he actually was so wicked that he sacrificed several of his own sons to pagan gods to try to get their blessing of his reign. He was an incredibly wicked, incredibly oppressive, and incredibly unjust and evil king. And all we learn about him in 2 Kings 21 is that he was the final downfall of the people of Israel before they went off into exile, and that he himself is carried off to Babylon in exile. And then his story is over. 2 Chronicles 33 doesn't deny any of that. And it reminds us of that, But then it goes on to do something new, to do something extra that I find incredibly encouraging. So here's how the story of Manasseh ends in 2 Chronicles 33. And I think it's a hopeful reminder that even when the situation is really broken, there's always hope. And also what's at the core of what we need to do if we're going to be a people of hope in the midst of disaster. Manasseh in 2 Chronicles 33 commits all this evil. He leads the people even more astray. Everything's going wrong. But then it says this: the Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore the Lord brought upon them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who captured Manasseh with hooks and bound him with chains of bronze and brought him to Babylon. And when he was in distress, Manasseh entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty, and God heard his plea, and God brought him back again from exile to Jerusalem into his kingdom. And then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Now, in the rest of the chapter, it makes clear, on the one hand, Manasseh's life turned around because he repented. It also makes clear this did not evade or allow Israel to avoid any of the consequences of Manasseh's reign. Israel still went into exile. The people of God overwhelmingly still continued in idolatry. And yet, even though in one sense it only made a difference for Manasseh's own relationship with God, the writer makes a really big point to say that even though Manasseh's 98% of his story was awful, even though he was the downfall of the people of Israel at this moment in history, that it ends on a note of hope and optimism, that he turned around, he admitted his sins, he acknowledged his errors and his idolatry, and God forgave him. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read it, but I encourage you to look it up. There is a Second Temple Jewish / apocryphal book called The Prayer of Manasseh. It's certainly not by Manasseh, it's much later. It's almost fan fiction, where it's some later writer imagining, what did Manasseh pray when he turned to God? And it's a beautiful prayer that just confesses his own sin and takes absolute responsibility for what's happened, but also just casts himself on the mercy of God and reminds us that whatever else is true of the God of Israel, he is a God of mercy and forgiveness. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to get to do it tomorrow, but originally I was really thinking about doing a session tomorrow called The Political Importance of Repentance. And when I look at our political scene today, on the right and the left, inside the church, outside the church, to me, one of the rarest realities in our political scene today is repentance. People who actually admit that they've made mistakes. People who actually admit that I should have gone left here, but I went right. I should have done this, but instead I treated God and I treated other people in ways that I shouldn't have. And as C.S. Lewis says, when you've been going the wrong direction for a long time, the shortest way back home is to backtrack and turn around. We always feel, both because maybe other people take advantage of it and because repentance feels counterproductive, that no, let's just dig in, sunk cost mentality, keep going. But I think one of the practices we should have as the people of God is regularly confessing our sins. And specifically, not exhaustively, specifically our political sins and our political unfaithfulness and the ways that we have been agents of injustice and sin and hate rather than love, of despair rather than hope, of selfishness rather than love for our neighbors. One of the things that distinguishes the people of Israel from the nations is that they're supposed to repent when they turn away from God. And so this story reminds me of what is so distinctive about Israel and Israel's God, namely that mercy, not justice, that hope, not condemnation, is at the heart of what drives history. And it's really easy to forget that in moments like this. So let me stop and we'll look at the Google Doc, and maybe Kirk and I can answer questions for a bit, and then Kirk's going to do his New Testament overview.